Welcome back to our exploration of game theory. As we continue this journey together, I want to start by asking you a question that might seem obvious at first, but stick with me because the answer is going to reveal something really important about the world we live in and the systems we navigate every single day. The question is this: what is school actually supposed to do? Now, before you answer that in your head, I want you to really think about it. Because most people, if you ask them this question, they will give you some vague answer about learning or getting a job or maybe preparing for life. But those answers do not really capture what is happening here. And they definitely do not explain why so many people feel like school is failing them. So, let me walk you through what school is officially designed to accomplish, and then we are going to examine whether it is actually doing those things, and if it is not doing those things, we need to understand why that is the case, because that is where game theory comes in. School exists for three primary purposes, and these aren't things I am making up. These are the stated goals that educators and policymakers talk about all the time when they discuss the purpose of education in modern society. The first purpose is literacy. And I don't just mean the ability to read words on a page. I mean the full capacity to absorb information from the world around you and then convey your own ideas back out into the world in a way that other people can understand and engage with. This is fundamental because in our society, if you cannot read and write effectively, you are essentially cut off from participating in most meaningful activities and conversations and opportunities. Reading lets you learn from people who came before you, even if they are dead, even if they lived thousands of years ago. And reading lets you preserve your thoughts and share them with people you will never meet. And this exchange of information across time and space is what allows civilization to progress and individuals to grow. So literacy is the foundation of everything else, and it is the first major purpose that schools are supposed to fulfill. The second purpose is what we call core competencies. And this is really about the skills that allow you to function effectively in society and to collaborate with other people and to solve complex problems. These are things like critical thinking, which means being able to analyze information and distinguish between good arguments and bad arguments and truth and falsehood, and being able to reason through difficult questions. It includes the ability to cooperate with others because very few important things in life can be accomplished alone. And if you cannot work with other people, you are going to struggle no matter how smart you are. It includes collaboration, which is closely related but slightly different because collaboration means not just working alongside someone, but actively building something together where the whole becomes greater than the sum of the parts. And it includes communication, which we already touched on with literacy. But communication goes beyond just writing. It includes speaking and listening and understanding how to convey ideas in different contexts to different audiences. These core competencies are supposed to be what school trains into you, so that when you leave school and enter society, you have the tools you need to navigate whatever challenges come your way. And then the third purpose is what we call lifelong learning. And this is especially important in the world we live in today, where everything changes so rapidly. We are living in an age of artificial intelligence and globalization and technological disruption, where the skills that are valuable today might be obsolete in 5 years, and the jobs that exist today might not exist tomorrow. So school cannot just be about cramming your head full of facts that you memorize for a test and then forget, because that approach doesn't prepare you for a world that is constantly evolving. Instead, school is supposed to teach you how to learn. And more importantly, it is supposed to make you love learning so that you continue to grow and adapt throughout your entire life. That means developing curiosity and intellectual humility and the willingness to admit when you don't know something and then go figure it out. It means understanding that education doesn't end when you graduate. It is just beginning, and you need to be in a constant state of growth and reflection and adaptation. These are the three core purposes of school: literacy, core competencies, and lifelong learning. Now, Here is where it gets interesting, and here is why we are having this conversation in the first place. If you look at most schools around the world, and I am not saying every school, but I am saying the vast majority of schools, they are failing spectacularly at all three of these purposes. In fact, you can make a pretty compelling argument that most schools don't just fail to teach these things, but they actually have the opposite effect. They make you hate reading instead of love it. They teach you to compete against your classmates instead of collaborating with them. And they make you despise learning so much that the moment you finish your final exam, you want to burn all your books and never open another one again. And if that is true, and I am going to show you that it is true, then we need to ask ourselves a really important question. Why? Why would a system that is supposedly designed to educate you instead make you hate education? Why would institutions that claim to value critical thinking actually reward conformity and obedience? Why would schools that say they want to prepare you for life actually prepare you to sit quietly and memorize information you will never use? That is the puzzle we are going to solve today using game theory. And I promise you, by the end of this, you are going to understand not just why schools fail, but why they are designed to fail, and what that tells us about the society we live in. So let's start with literacy, because this is probably the most basic function of school, and it is also the area where the failure is most obvious and most measurable. When I say literacy, I am talking about the ability to read books and absorb complex information and then express your own thoughts in writing in a way that is clear and persuasive. Now, you might think, okay, well, everyone learns to read in elementary school, so mission accomplished, right? Wrong. Because there is a massive difference between being able to sound out words on a page and actually being literate in any meaningful sense. Today, in most schools around the world, students are not required to read books anymore. And I am not exaggerating when I say this. If you go to university, which is supposed to be the pinnacle of education, the professors there are so shocked by how little students read that they have had to completely change their teaching methods. Instead of assigning books or even full chapters, they assign paragraphs or maybe a few pages at most. Many professors have given up on reading entirely, and instead, they show videos or use multimedia presentations because they know that if they assign a book, nobody is going to read it. And it is not just that students don't read, it is that they have lost the capacity to read in any sustained way. People's attention spans have collapsed to the point where it is very difficult for a professor to give an hour-long lecture without losing the entire room after about 5 minutes. Students are constantly checking their phones or zoning out or waiting for class to end. And this isn't because students today are stupider than students in the past. It is because the system has trained them to have short attention spans and to expect constant stimulation and to avoid anything that requires sustained mental effort. Now, think about what this means for a second. Reading is the foundation of literacy, and literacy is the foundation of everything else. If you cannot read a book, you cannot engage with complex ideas, and if you cannot engage with complex ideas, you cannot think critically. And if you cannot think critically, you are basically at the mercy of whoever controls the flow of information in society. You become easy to manipulate because you don't have the intellectual tools to question what you are being told, or to seek out alternative perspectives, or to evaluate evidence for yourself. And writing is even worse because, at least with reading, you can measure it and see that people are reading less. With writing, there is this perception that everyone can write because everyone sends text messages and emails. But that is not writing in any meaningful sense. Real writing means being able to construct an argument and develop it over multiple pages, and anticipate objections and use evidence to support your claims and organize your thoughts in a logical structure. Most students cannot do this. And more importantly, most students have never been taught how to do this because schools don't prioritize writing anymore. So when I say schools are failing at literacy, I don't just mean they are doing a mediocre job. I mean they are actively making students less literate than they would be otherwise. Students come in with natural curiosity and the desire to understand the world, and schools beat that out of them through a combination of boring assignments and meaningless tests, and a focus on memorization rather than comprehension. By the time students graduate, many of them have gone years without reading a single book cover to cover, and they see reading as a chore rather than a pleasure, and that is a catastrophic failure for any educational system. Now, let me dig deeper into this attention span issue, because it is connected to literacy, but it is also its own separate problem, and it tells us something really important about how schools function. When you are young, your attention span is naturally shorter than it will be when you are older. But that doesn't mean children cannot focus. It just means they focus differently. Young children can spend hours playing with toys or building with blocks or exploring their environment because those activities are engaging and meaningful to them. The problem isn't that children cannot pay attention. The problem is that schools give them nothing worth paying attention to. Think about what a typical classroom looks like. And I want you to really visualize this because it is important. You have 50 students packed into a room, sitting in rows, all facing the front, where a teacher stands and lectures at them for an hour. The students are not allowed to move. They are not allowed to talk to each other. They're just supposed to sit there and absorb information passively. And not only that, but the information being delivered is often boring or irrelevant or presented in a way that has no connection to students' lived experience or interest or questions about the world. So what happens? Students tune out. They start daydreaming or passing notes or counting the minutes until class ends. And then the school system looks at this behavior and says, oh, students these days have such short attention spans. We need to make everything more entertaining. We need to use more technology. We need to keep things moving quickly so they don't get bored. But that is exactly the wrong response. Because what the system is actually doing is training students to expect constant stimulation and to be unable to engage with anything that requires sustained focus or deep thought. This is what I mean when I say schools have the opposite effect of what they claim to want. Schools say they want to develop students' ability to think deeply and engage with complex material, but then they structure everything in a way that makes deep thinking impossible. They break knowledge up into tiny disconnected units. They test constantly to make sure students are memorizing facts. And they move so quickly from topic to topic that there is never time to really understand anything or let ideas marinate or make connections between different areas of knowledge. And then on top of all that, you have technology, which has made this problem exponentially worse. Students now grow up with smartphones and social media and video games that are specifically designed to hijack their attention and provide instant gratification and constant novelty. So when they come to school and they are asked to sit still and focus on something difficult for an extended period of time, their brains literally cannot do it anymore because they have been rewired by these technologies to expect something different. But here is the thing, and this is really important to understand. This isn't an accident. The school system isn't accidentally making students unable to focus. It is doing this systematically. And the reason it is doing this is because the system isn't actually designed to create deep thinkers. It is designed to create compliant workers who can follow instructions and perform routine tasks and not ask too many questions. We are going to come back to this idea later when we talk about game theory. But for now, just understand that the attention crisis in schools is not a bug. It is a feature of the system. Now, let's talk about the second purpose of school, which is developing core competencies. And in particular, let's talk about collaboration, because this is where the disconnect between what schools say they want and what they actually incentivize becomes really obvious. Schools love to talk about collaboration and teamwork and the importance of working with others. And if you look at any school's mission statement or marketing materials, they will have all this language about preparing students to work in teams and building communication skills and fostering a collaborative learning environment. But now let's look at what actually happens in schools and ask yourself whether the system is really set up to encourage collaboration. In most schools, students are ranked against each other based on their grades. And this ranking determines everything from which classes you can take to which colleges will accept you to how your parents and teachers perceive you. And here's the key point. It is a zero-sum game. For you to move up in the ranking, someone else has to move down. If everyone in your class does well, that doesn't help you at all. In fact, it hurts you because it means the curve is higher and your relative performance looks worse. So, what does this system incentivize? It incentivizes you to view your classmates as competitors, not collaborators. It rewards you for hoarding information and resources rather than sharing them. If you figure out a really effective way to study for a test, the last thing you want to do is tell your classmates about it. Because if they use your method and their grades improve, that makes your grade look worse by comparison. This is insane, right? Like if you actually stop and think about it, this is a completely insane way to structure an educational environment. In the real world, the most successful people are those who know how to work with others and build teams and leverage collective intelligence to solve problems that no individual could solve alone. But schools teach you to do the opposite. They teach you that success means beating other people and that helping others is actually detrimental to your own interests. And then we wonder why, when students enter the workforce, they struggle with teamwork and collaboration and all these soft skills that employers say they want but cannot seem to find in new graduates. And it is not just that schools fail to teach collaboration. It is that they actively punish it. If you work together with another student on an assignment that is supposed to be done individually, that is called cheating and you can get expelled for it. If you share your notes with a classmate who is absent or struggling, you are not being rewarded for helping. You are being told you are enabling someone else's laziness. The entire system is built on this model of individual competition, where collaboration is seen as a form of cheating rather than a valuable skill. Now, some schools have started to include group projects in their curriculum, and they will point to this as evidence that they are teaching collaboration. But anyone who has ever been part of a group project knows that they usually don't work the way they are supposed to. What happens is one or two responsible students end up doing all the work while everyone else coasts, and the responsible students learn to resent their teammates rather than learning how to collaborate effectively. That is not collaboration. That is just a different form of competition where the game is about avoiding work rather than doing work. Now let's talk about the third purpose of school, which is lifelong learning. And here I want to tell you about something that happens in China that perfectly illustrates how badly schools fail at this goal. In China, students spend years preparing for the national entrance examination, which happens when you are 18 years old. And this exam basically determines your entire future. If you do well, you can go to a good university and have good career prospects. And if you don't do well, you are kind of screwed. So students work incredibly hard studying for this exam, often 12 or 14 hours a day, memorizing enormous amounts of information. And then when the exam is over, do you know what happens? There is a ceremony, and it has become a tradition across China, where students take all their textbooks and all their notes and everything they have been studying for years, and they rip out the pages and throw them in the air. Some students actually burn their books, which is where the term book burning comes from. And this isn't a small thing. This isn't just a few students letting off steam. This is thousands and thousands of students across the country engaging in this ritual that is explicitly about celebrating the end of learning and the freedom from ever having to read a book or take a test again. Now, think about what this tells us. These students have just spent years working harder than most people will ever work at anything in their entire lives. They have sacrificed their childhood and their social lives and their health in many cases to prepare for this exam. And the moment it is over, their overwhelming emotion is not pride or satisfaction or curiosity about what they will learn next. It is relief that they never have to learn again. They want to destroy every physical reminder of their education because education has become synonymous with suffering and oppression and being forced to do things you hate. This is the opposite of lifelong learning. Lifelong learning means you develop a love of learning that sustains you throughout your life and makes you curious about the world and eager to keep growing and discovering new things. But what schools actually do is make you hate learning so much that you want to burn your books and never think about school again. And this isn't unique to China, by the way. This happens everywhere. It is just more visible in China because of the book burning ceremony. But ask yourself, when was the last time you met someone who graduated from school and said, "Oh, I cannot wait to keep learning. I am going to read books and take courses and explore new subjects for fun"? Most people, the moment they finish school, they stop learning entirely unless they are forced to for work. And even then, they do the bare minimum required to keep their job. They don't read books, they don't seek out new knowledge, they don't question their assumptions or try to grow as people. And why would they? School has taught them that learning is painful and boring and something you have to be forced to do rather than something that brings joy and meaning and helps you understand yourself and the world better. So when we look at these three purposes of school, literacy, core competencies, and lifelong learning, we see that schools are not just failing to achieve these goals, they are actively working against them. They are making students less literate, less collaborative, and less interested in learning. And this brings us to the central question that we are going to explore using game theory. Why? Why would a system that claims to have these goals systematically fail to achieve them? What is really going on here? And that is what we are going to figure out together. Okay? So now I want to tell you a personal story because this story is going to illustrate all the principles of game theory that we are going to explore, and it is also going to show you what happens when someone tries to reform a system without understanding how the game actually works. The year is 2008, and I had just graduated from Yale College in the United States, where I was an English major. I did very well in school. I was a good student. I understood how the academic system worked, and because of my success, I was hired to go to Shenzhen, which is a city in South China, and help a school called Shenzhen Middle School build an international program to send students abroad. Now, this was 2008, which was a long time ago, and back then, not that many Chinese students were going abroad to study. International schools were pretty rare, and the whole industry of preparing students for American universities was still in its early stages. So I arrived at this school, and I was excited because I thought this was going to be a chance to really make a difference, to help students get a world-class education and prepare them for success, not just in getting into good universities, but in life more broadly. The first thing I did was look at what the school was already doing. And I have to say, I was pretty shocked by what I found. There were about 80 students per year who wanted to go abroad, which is actually a lot. But the way they were preparing was completely wrong in my view. They were still taking regular Chinese classes, which meant sitting in a room with 50 other kids, taking notes from a teacher who lectured at them for an hour, and never asking questions or debating ideas or actually engaging with the material in any meaningful way. And then, in terms of preparing for American universities, the students were spending all their time memorizing SAT word lists. Now, if you don't know what the SAT is, it is a standardized test that American universities use, and there is a vocabulary section where you need to know a lot of obscure words. So students had these lists of thousands of words, and they would just memorize them without any context, without reading them in sentences, without understanding how they are actually used. They were just cramming words into their heads so they could recognize them on a test, and then they forget them immediately afterwards. And then the other thing students were doing to make their college applications look good was Model United Nations. Now, Model UN can be a great activity. I am not saying there is anything wrong with it. But the problem was everyone was doing it. There was absolutely no differentiation. Every single student had Model UN on their application. And admissions officers in America would look at these applications and see the same thing over and over and over. It was like every Chinese student had gotten together and decided they were all going to do exactly the same thing. So I looked at this situation. I thought, okay, these students are smart and hardworking, and they might be able to get into some decent American universities just based on their test scores, but they are not actually prepared to succeed once they get there. Because American universities are very different from Chinese schools. They expect you to participate in discussions and write analytical papers and think critically and work independently. And these students had never been trained to do any of those things. So I decided I was going to make some changes to really prepare these students properly. So here is what I did, and I want you to understand that at the time I thought I was being really innovative and progressive and student-centered in my approach. The first major change I made was setting up a seminar system. Instead of having students sit in those big Chinese classes with 50 kids, I brought in American teachers to lead small seminars with maybe 10 or 20 students where they would actually discuss books together. This is how American universities work. And it is a completely different pedagogical model where the teacher is more of a facilitator than a lecturer, and students learn by engaging with each other's ideas. The second thing I did was get rid of the SAT wordless memorization and replace it with actual reading. I wanted students to read books cover to cover and engage with complex ideas and develop their analytical skills. To support this, I established a 5,000 book English library at the school where students could borrow books and read for pleasure, not just for assignments. This was actually the first significant English library in a Chinese high school in that region. And my goal was to teach students the joy of reading, to show them that books could be interesting and meaningful rather than just tools for memorization. The third major change I made was in terms of extracurricular activities. And here, I really wanted to give students hands-on experience with real-world challenges rather than just sitting around talking in Model UN. So I set up 2 new activities, and both of them were first in China at that time. The first was called a coffee house, and this was literally a coffee shop that students had to run as a business. They had to work as waiters and baristas. They had to handle money and manage inventory and provide good customer service. And they had to collaborate as a team to make the whole thing work. Now, think about what this teaches you that a regular classroom doesn't. You are learning entrepreneurship and finance and customer service and teamwork, but you are learning it by actually doing it, not by reading about it in a textbook. If you give a customer bad service, they are not going to come back. And that is immediate feedback that teaches you something real. If you don't manage your inventory properly, you run out of supplies and the business suffers. This is experiential learning, and it is incredibly valuable, especially for students who had spent their entire lives sitting in classrooms being lectured at. The second activity I set up was a daily newspaper, and this was even more ambitious. Students had to report news every single day. They had to write articles and edit them and lay out the pages and then print the newspaper and distribute it to the entire school by 7 inches the morning. This meant students were working until midnight or 2 inches the morning and then getting up at dawn to deliver papers. And it was exhausting, but it was also incredibly educational. They were learning journalism and writing and time management and how to work under pressure and how to make decisions quickly when you don't have perfect information. Now, you might be thinking, okay, these all sound like good changes. What could possibly go wrong? But remember, we are studying game theory here, and game theory is about understanding how systems actually work, not how we wish they would work. I made all these changes without fully understanding who the players were in this game and what their actual motivations were. I thought if I built a better system, everyone would naturally support it because it was better. But that is not how the world works, and I was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Now, I understood that if I wanted these new activities and this new curriculum to succeed, I couldn't just change the activities themselves. I had to change the entire culture of the school and the way people thought about education. So I established 3 core principles that I wanted to govern everything we did, and these principles were transparency, innovation, and openness. Now, let me explain what I meant by each of these, because they are important for understanding what happened next. Transparency meant that rather than pretending we had everything figured out, I wanted to be honest with students and parents and teachers about the fact that we were experimenting and learning as we went. My idea was that we wouldn't try to create a perfect curriculum from day one. Instead, we would create something good and then we would continuously improve it based on what we learned. We would admit our mistakes openly and then we would fix them together. And that process of continuous improvement and reflection would itself be educational because that is how real learning works in life. Innovation meant I was willing to try new things and make changes, even if they created some chaos in the short term. I didn't want us to get stuck in the old ways of doing things just because that is how they had always been done. If something wasn't working, I wanted the freedom to change it quickly and try something different. And I wanted students and teachers to embrace that experimental mindset rather than demanding perfect stability and predictability all the time. And openness meant I was committed to being honest about everything we were doing and why we were doing it. I would explain my reasoning to students and parents and teachers, and I would listen to feedback, and I would treat everyone as intelligent partners in this educational project rather than just following orders from above. I really believe that if people understood what we were trying to accomplish and why, they would naturally support it, even if there were some bumps along the way. And you know what? It worked. After the first semester, and certainly after the first year, this program became very effective. Students were thriving. They were reading books for the first time in their lives and actually enjoying it. They were developing real skills in the coffee house and the newspaper. They were learning to think critically and express themselves clearly. The results were undeniable. Students from this program started getting into top American universities, Yale and Wharton and Cornell and other elite schools. The program became famous across South China. We had the best college admissions record in the region, and other schools started copying what we were doing. So this sounds like a huge success story, right? I created an innovative program, it worked. Students succeeded, everyone should be happy. But here is where the game theory comes in, because what happened next was not at all what I expected. Despite the fact that the program was successful, despite the fact that students were getting into great schools, despite the fact that we were getting recognition across the region, I was fired. They told me to get out and never come back. And it wasn't just the administrators who wanted me gone. The teachers and the parents and even many of the students were happy to see me leave. So why was I fired? What did I do wrong? Well, according to everyone around me, the problem was that I was a dictator. That was the word they used. Not reformer, not visionary, not innovator, but dictator. And there was another word they used even more frequently, and that word was unfair. Now, at first when I heard this, I was confused because I didn't think I was being a dictator or unfair. I thought I was being fair and reasonable and focused on what was best for students. But I was missing something crucial about how the game actually works. The reason people called me a dictator was because I insisted on fairness. And I want you to really hear this because it is important. I insisted that every student would be treated equally regardless of who their parents were or how much money they had or how much influence they could bring to bear on the school. I believed that students should succeed or fail based on their own merit and their own effort. And I refused to give special treatment to anyone. And that pissed off a lot of very powerful people. Because here is the thing that I didn't understand at the time. The game is not fair and it is not supposed to be fair. The game is established by stakeholders who have power and influence, and they play the game according to their interest. When you have rich and powerful parents, they expect that their kids will get special treatment. They expect that teachers will give their kids better grades or more attention or more opportunities, and they expect that administrators will defer to them when there is any kind of conflict or disagreement. And I came in and said, no, we are not playing that game. Everyone gets treated the same. And that was seen as a radical and unacceptable position. From their perspective, I was the one who was being unreasonable because I was trying to impose my own rules on a game that already had established rules. They didn't hire me to change the fundamental nature of how the system works. They hired me to help their kids get into good American universities while preserving the existing power structure. And when I tried to do more than that, they got rid of me. Now, here is what is really interesting about this. And this is where game theory starts to become useful. After I was fired from that school, I went on to create similar programs at other schools, and I was actually quite successful at it for a few years. But after about 4 years of doing this, I was never allowed to work in school management or administration again. No one would hire me for that kind of role, even though I had a proven track record of creating successful programs and getting students into top universities. And the reason is that I had developed a reputation as someone who couldn't be controlled. I was too idealistic, too committed to fairness, too willing to challenge the existing power structure, and schools don't want that. They want administrators who understand how the game is really played and who will protect the interests of the powerful stakeholders. This is a pattern that repeats itself in education and in every other field. Whenever someone tries to reform a system without understanding how that system actually works and who benefits from keeping it the way it is, they get pushed out. The system protects itself against reformers because reformers are threats to the people who have power within the system. Okay, so now we are going to use game theory to analyze what happened and to understand why schools work the way they do. The first concept we need to understand is stakeholders. And in game theory, stakeholders are just the players in any given game. Every system, every institution, every social interaction involves multiple players. And each player has their own interests and motivations and strategies. If you want to understand how any system works, you need to identify who all the players are and what each player wants and how their interests interact with each other. So in the education system, who are the players? You have students, obviously. They are the ones who are supposedly being educated. You have parents who are paying for education and who have strong opinions about what should happen. You have teachers who are delivering the education day to day. You have administrators and school leaders who are managing the institution. You have the government, which sets policies and provides funding and oversees the whole system. And you have colleges and universities, which are the next step in the educational pipeline and which have their own requirements and priorities. These are the 6 main players in the education game: students, parents, teachers, administrators, government, and colleges. Now, here is the crucial point that I didn't understand when I started working at that school in Shenzhen. I thought I understood what each of these players wanted, but I was completely wrong about their actual motivations. I had this naive view of how education works, and I assumed everyone shared my values and my goals. And when it turned out they didn't, I was shocked and confused, and ultimately I got pushed out. So, let me tell you what I thought each player wanted back in 2008 when I was young and idealistic and hadn't yet learned how the world really works. I thought students wanted to love learning and get into Ivy League schools and be the best possible version of themselves. I thought they were motivated by curiosity and ambition and the desire for self-improvement. I thought parents wanted successful kids who were independent thinkers and who would have face-meaning social status by getting into prestigious universities, but ultimately wanted what was best for their children's development. I thought teachers wanted to do a good job and really teach students and were passionate about their subject matter and just needed to be given the space and freedom to teach what they loved. I thought administrators wanted good results, and as long as I provided good outcomes, like students getting into top universities, they would be happy and support my work. I thought the government wanted innovation and technology and strong workers who could help China compete globally. And I thought colleges wanted the best possible students who showed potential to be future leaders and who were intellectually curious and hardworking. Now, can you see what is wrong with this picture? These assumptions might sound reasonable on the surface, but they are completely divorced from how people actually behave and what actually motivates them. I was thinking about how I wish the world worked rather than how it actually works. And that is why I failed. Because if you don't understand what players really want, you cannot predict how they will behave. And you cannot design a system that will actually function in the real world. So now, let me tell you what each of these players actually wants and how the game really works. Let's start with students, because they are supposedly the whole point of the education system, right? Everything is allegedly designed for their benefit. But what do students actually want? Well, here is the uncomfortable truth. Most students don't come to school to learn. Their primary motivation is to be popular and make friends. That might sound cynical, but think about your own experience, or if you are not a student anymore, think back to when you were in school. What was actually most important to you on a day-to-day basis? Was it mastering calculus or understanding history? Or was it having friends and being liked and fitting in with your peer group? For most people, the social dimension of school is far more important than the academic dimension. And that is just human nature. We are social creatures. And especially when we are young, the need for social acceptance and belonging is incredibly powerful. So students are primarily motivated by popularity, by having friends, by being part of a social group. Everything else is secondary to that. And this creates all kinds of problems for learning, because if you are too focused on academics, you might be seen as a nerd or a teacher's pet, and that can hurt your social status. So students often have to balance between doing well enough academically to satisfy parents and teachers while not doing so well that it makes them socially weird. The second thing students want is to please their parents and teachers. And this is really important to understand. You are not in school to learn. You are in school to please the adults who have power over you. Parents are the ones who provide for you financially and emotionally. And if you don't please them, your life becomes very difficult. Teachers are the ones who give you grades. And grades determine what opportunities you will have in the future. So students learn very quickly that success in school is not really about mastering knowledge. It is about figuring out what the adults want and giving it to them. And this is fundamentally different from real learning, right? Real learning is about curiosity and exploration and understanding things for their own sake. But school teaches you to focus on external validation rather than internal motivation. You study not because you are curious about a subject, but because you want a good grade. You complete assignments not because they are meaningful or interesting, but because the teacher told you to, and you will be punished if you don't. This creates a mindset where education becomes something that is done to you rather than something you actively pursue. The third thing students want is to have fun. And this makes sense because life should be enjoyable, right? But the problem is that school is generally not fun. It is boring and stressful and exhausting. So students are constantly looking for ways to make school more tolerable, whether that is goofing off in class or cutting corners on assignments or finding ways to minimize the amount of work they have to do. And again, this is rational behavior given the constraints they are operating under, but it is not behavior that leads to actual learning or growth. And finally, students want to get into a good college because they have been told their entire lives that their future depends on it. But here is the thing. Most students don't actually understand why college is important or what they want to study or what they want to do with their lives. They just know that getting into a prestigious university is the next checkbox they need to tick to keep the adults happy and keep their options open. So they are motivated by college admissions, but not by any deeper sense of purpose or calling. They are playing a game and trying to win, but they don't really know why they are playing or what winning actually means. Now, let's talk about parents. And this is where things get really interesting because parents are actually the most powerful players in the education game. The reason is simple. Parents pay for education. And parents can cause enormous problems for schools if they are not happy. So schools are incredibly responsive to what parents want, even if what parents want is not actually good for students. And what do parents really want? Well, on the surface, they will say they want successful kids who are happy and fulfilled. But let's dig deeper into what is really going on. The first thing parents want is face, which is a concept that is especially important in Chinese culture, but exists everywhere. Face means social status and reputation, and the ability to brag about your kids to your relatives and friends and colleagues. Parents want to be able to say, my kid got into Harvard, or my kid is studying at an international school, because that reflects well on them as parents and elevates their status in their social circle. And here is a key point. They don't necessarily care whether the education is actually good. They care whether it looks good to other people. This is why international schools are so popular, even when they are not actually providing a better education than local schools. International schools are more expensive and they have white teachers. And those two factors make them a luxury product that confers status on the parents who can afford them. Think about it like this. If you are a parent and you are deciding between two schools and one costs twice as much as the other and has a bunch of white faces walking around, which one are you going to choose? You are probably going to choose the expensive one with white teachers, not because you have carefully evaluated the curriculum or the outcomes, but because it signals to everyone around you that you have money and sophistication. The second thing parents want is control over their children. And this often conflicts with the goal of developing independent thinkers. Parents believe that they know what is best for their kids. And in many cases, they are probably right about some things. But the problem is that parents often want their kids to follow a very specific path. And they don't want teachers or schools or anyone else interfering with their plans. They want their kids to obey them and trust their judgment and not ask too many questions or develop ideas that might challenge the parents' worldview. This is especially true in cultures where filial piety is a strong value, where children are expected to honor and obey their parents above all else. In these contexts, the idea that school might teach kids to think critically or question authority or make their own decisions is actually threatening to parents. They didn't send their kids to school to become rebels or independent thinkers. They sent them to school to get good grades and get into good universities so they can have stable, successful lives that make the parents proud. The third thing parents want is good outcomes. But, and this is crucial, they define good outcomes very narrowly. A good outcome means good grades and admission to a prestigious university. It doesn't mean that the kid is actually learning or growing as a person or developing skills that will serve them throughout their lives. Parents don't have time to evaluate those things, and they wouldn't know how to evaluate them even if they wanted to. What they can evaluate is grades and test scores and college admissions. Those are concrete, measurable outcomes that everyone understands. So parents pressure schools to deliver these outcomes, regardless of whether the methods used to achieve them are actually educational. If that means teachers give easy grades to keep parents happy, fine. If that means students cheat or take shortcuts, fine. As long as the final numbers look good, parents are essentially customers who are purchasing a product, and the product they want is impressive credentials for their kids, not actual education. And schools respond to this market pressure by giving customers what they want, even when what they want is not what their kids actually need. Now let's talk about teachers, because teachers are the ones who actually deliver education day to day, and their motivations are crucial for understanding how schools actually function. And here is what I learned after working in schools for several years. Most teachers are not passionate educators who love teaching and want to inspire students. Most teachers view teaching as a job, and like any other job, they want to do the minimum amount of work required to get by and collect their salary. Now, before you get upset and say I am being unfair to teachers, let me explain why this is rational behavior. Teaching is actually an incredibly demanding job if you do it well. To be a truly great teacher, you need to prepare engaging lessons and grade assignments thoughtfully and meet with students individually and stay current with developments in your field and constantly reflect on your practice and adjust your methods. This is exhausting work that requires enormous amounts of time and energy and emotional labor. And here is the problem. Schools don't actually reward teachers for doing this work well. You don't get paid more for being a great teacher versus a mediocre teacher in most systems. In fact, if you are a great teacher who really challenges students and gives honest feedback and holds them to high standards, you are more likely to get complaints from parents and students who are unhappy with their grades or with how hard they have to work. So the system actually punishes excellence and rewards mediocrity. The safest strategy as a teacher is to give easy grades and entertaining but not particularly challenging lessons and stay out of trouble. If you do that, parents are happy, administrators are happy, students are happy, and you can keep your job without working too hard. On top of that, teachers have their own lives and their own responsibilities outside of school. They have families and financial pressures and health issues and all the other things that every adult deals with. Teaching is not their whole life. It is just their job. So when they are making decisions about how much effort to put into lesson planning or grading or meeting with students, they are making rational calculations about how to balance their work responsibilities with everything else they have going on. And in most cases, the rational choice is to do what is minimally required rather than going above and beyond. Now, there are certainly teachers who are passionate and dedicated and who pour their hearts into their work. And I am not trying to diminish them. But if we are being honest, those teachers are the exception, not the rule. And the system doesn't really support or encourage that kind of dedication. In fact, the system often burns out the passionate teachers because they work so hard and care so much, and then they get frustrated when they see that the system doesn't actually value what they are trying to do. So they either adapt and become more cynical, or they leave teaching altogether. What this means is that you cannot build an education system that relies on teachers being heroic and self-sacrificing and endlessly passionate. You have to design a system that works even when teachers are just ordinary people doing a job and trying to get by. And the current system is actually quite well designed for that purpose. It allows teachers to maintain the appearance of teaching without requiring them to actually do the hard work of real education. They can show up, give boring lectures, assign pointless busy work, and maintain order in the classroom, and that is considered adequate performance. Now, let's talk about school administrators, because they play a crucial role in determining how schools actually function. Administrators are people like principals and vice principals and department heads. Basically, anyone who has management responsibility in the school. And what do administrators want? Well, officially they want good educational outcomes and a well-functioning school where students are learning and teachers are teaching and everyone is happy. But in practice, what administrators really want is to keep their jobs and avoid problems, and maintain good relationships with powerful parents. The key thing to understand about administrators is that they are middle management in a complex organization with lots of competing pressures. Above them, they have government authorities or school boards or owners who have their own demands. Below them, they have teachers and students who can cause problems if they are unhappy. And around them, they have parents who can be incredibly demanding and who have the power to get administrators fired if they are not satisfied. So administrators are constantly trying to balance all these different interests and keep everyone happy enough that they don't rock the boat. In this context, the most important relationship for administrators is with powerful parents. And by powerful, I mean parents who have money or political connections or social status. These are the parents who can cause real problems for a school if they are unhappy. They can complain to higher authorities, they can withdraw their kids and tell other parents to do the same. They can damage the school's reputation in the community. So administrators spend an enormous amount of time and energy keeping these parents happy, even if it means compromising educational principles. What does this look like in practice? It means that if a powerful parent complains that their kid got a bad grade, the administrator will pressure the teacher to change the grade. If a powerful parent wants their kid to get special treatment or exceptions to the rules, the administrator will make it happen. If a powerful parent doesn't like a particular teacher or administrator, that person will likely be fired or reassigned. The school is essentially being run to serve the interests of its most powerful stakeholders, and everyone else has to adapt to that reality. Now, you might think, okay, but surely administrators care about educational quality and student outcomes, right? And the answer is yes, but only insofar as those things affect the school's reputation and the satisfaction of important stakeholders. Administrators want good college admissions results because that is something they can advertise and that attracts more families to the school. But they don't particularly care whether students are actually learning or developing critical thinking skills or becoming better people, because those things are harder to measure and market. This is why I got fired, even though my program was successful. Yes, students were getting into top universities, which looked good for the school, but I was also refusing to give special treatment to powerful families, and I was challenging the existing power structure, and I was creating chaos with all my changes and transparency and innovation. From the administrator's perspective, I was more trouble than I was worth because I was making powerful parents unhappy, and that was a bigger problem than any benefits my program was providing. It is that simple. Now, let's talk about the government's role in education, because government is one of the stakeholders, even though it might not seem as directly involved as parents or teachers. Governments set education policy. They provide funding for schools. They establish curriculum requirements and testing standards. And they have a lot of power over how education systems function. So what does the government want from education? Well, if you listen to government officials, they will talk about innovation and creativity and developing human capital and building a competitive workforce that can drive economic growth and technological advancement. But here is what governments actually want, and this is true pretty much everywhere in the world. Governments want compliance. They want citizens who follow rules and obey authority and don't cause problems. They want workers who show up on time and do what they are told and don't ask too many questions or challenge the system. Education is fundamentally about socialization, about teaching young people how to fit into the existing social order and accept its norms and values. Everything else is secondary to that basic function. Think about how schools are structured and what they actually teach. Students are taught to sit still for hours at a time, following a rigid schedule that breaks the day into discrete periods. They are taught to raise their hand and wait to be called on before speaking. They are taught that there is one right answer to every question, and that answer is whatever the teacher or textbook says. They are taught to compete against each other for grades and rankings. They are taught to defer to authority and not question the rules. Does any of this sound like training for innovation and critical thinking? Or does it sound more like training for obedience? Governments say they want innovation, but innovation is actually quite threatening to established power structures. Real innovation means questioning assumptions and trying new things and sometimes failing and learning from mistakes. It means challenging conventional wisdom and not accepting things just because that is how they have always been done. And governments don't really want that kind of disruptive thinking in their citizens. What they want is just enough creativity and problem-solving ability to drive economic growth, but not so much that people start questioning the fundamental legitimacy of the system. This is why governments are actually quite happy with mediocre schools as long as those schools don't cause major problems. A school that produces compliant citizens who have basic skills and who don't rebel or cause social unrest is a successful school from the government's perspective, even if students aren't really learning much or developing their full potential. And a school that produces creative, critical thinkers who question authority and challenge the status quo is actually a problem, even if those students are more intellectually capable. So when you hear governments talking about education reform and improving schools and raising standards, you have to understand that they are operating within very narrow constraints. They want schools to be just good enough to maintain social stability and economic competitiveness, but not so good that they produce citizens who might threaten existing power structures. And this is one of the fundamental contradictions in education policy everywhere. The stated goals of education, innovation, creativity, critical thinking are actually in tension with what governments really want, which is compliance and social order. Now, let's talk about colleges and universities, because they are the final player in this game. And in many ways, they are the ones who set the terms that everyone else has to respond to. Students and parents and schools are all trying to optimize for college admissions. So colleges have enormous power to shape the entire education system. And what do colleges say they want? They say they want passionate, curious students who will be future leaders and innovators, and who will make important contributions to society. They talk about holistic admissions and looking at the whole person and seeking students with unique perspectives and diverse backgrounds. But here is what colleges actually want. And I am going to be blunt about this because I think it is important to be honest. Colleges want money. Higher education, especially in the United States, has become a massive industry. And universities need revenue to survive. International students are particularly valuable because they typically pay full tuition with no financial aid. So, when Chinese students apply to American universities with the ability to pay $50,000 or $80,000 or $100,000 per year, those students are very attractive to admissions offices regardless of their qualifications. Now, I am not saying colleges will admit anyone who can pay. They still have standards and they want to maintain their reputation and their rankings. But the bar for admission is significantly lower for students who can afford full tuition, especially at schools that aren't in the very top tier. And even at elite schools, there is enormous pressure to admit wealthy students because those students and their families can become donors who fund new buildings and endow professorships and generally keep the university financially healthy. The other thing colleges want is students who will be successful and reflect well on the institution. But notice how they define success. It is not really about intellectual development or personal growth or becoming a good citizen. Success means having a prestigious career and making lots of money and becoming famous or powerful. And who is most likely to achieve that kind of success? Not necessarily the most brilliant or hardworking students, but students who come from wealthy, well-connected families who already have access to opportunities and networks and resources. This is why, if you look at who actually gets into Ivy League schools, there is a huge overrepresentation of students from wealthy families. Yes, these students are generally smart and accomplished, but so are thousands of other students who don't get in. The difference is that wealthy students have parents who can donate to the university or who know people on the admissions committee, or who can provide opportunities for their kids that make their application stand out. The game is rigged, and colleges are complicit in keeping it rigged because it serves their financial interests. So when schools are trying to prepare students for college admissions, they are not really trying to help students become better thinkers or more knowledgeable people. They are trying to help students game the system and present themselves in ways that colleges find attractive. That might mean padding resumes with impressive sounding extracurriculars, or crafting personal statements that tell a compelling story, even if it is not entirely authentic, or finding ways to signal wealth and status without being too obvious about it. And this is not education. It is marketing. And everyone involved knows it, but we all pretend otherwise. Okay, so now we have identified all the players in the education game: students, parents, teachers, administrators, government, and colleges. But here is a crucial point that I need to make clear. Not all players are equal. Some players have much more power than others. And if you want to understand how the game really works, you need to understand the hierarchy of power. This is one of the big mistakes I made when I was trying to reform the school in Shenzhen. I treated all stakeholders as if they had equal weight and equal voice, but that is not how power actually works. So, let's rank these players by their actual influence over how schools function. At the bottom, we have students. And I know that sounds counterintuitive because students are supposedly what the whole system is for, but the reality is that students have almost no power in the education system. They cannot choose their curriculum or their teachers or their schedule. They cannot opt out of things they find pointless or stupid. They are essentially captive participants who have to play the game according to rules they had no role in creating. What students actually think and want and need doesn't really matter to how the system operates. Next, we have government and colleges. And these players are more powerful than students, but they are still not the most important. Government has formal authority, but government officials are usually far removed from what actually happens in individual schools on a day-to-day basis. They set broad policies and standards, but they don't really care about any particular school as long as it is not causing major problems. Colleges are similar. They have influence because everyone is trying to impress them, but they are not directly involved in how schools operate. And they don't really care that much about any individual student as long as they are getting applications and tuition revenue. Then we have administrators. And administrators are quite powerful because they make decisions about hiring and firing and resources and how rules are interpreted and enforced. But administrators are still constrained by forces above and around them. They have to answer to school boards or government authorities or owners, and they have to keep parents happy or they lose their jobs. So administrators have power, but it is power within certain limits. Next, we have teachers. And teachers are actually more powerful than you might think because they are the ones implementing the system on a daily basis. How teachers actually behave in classrooms matters a lot more than what is written in policy documents or curriculum guides. If teachers don't want to implement a reform or change their practices, they can just ignore directives from above, and in most cases, nobody will notice or care. So teachers have significant power through collective passive resistance. But the most powerful players in the education system are parents, and specifically wealthy, connected parents who have resources and social capital. These are the people who can make or break a school through their satisfaction or dissatisfaction. If important parents are happy, they will recommend the school to others and provide donations and support its reputation. If important parents are unhappy, they will complain and withdraw their kids and trash the school's reputation and potentially get people fired. So, schools organize themselves around keeping these parents happy more than anything else. This power hierarchy explains so much about why schools function the way they do. The system is responsive to the needs and preferences of powerful parents, not to what would actually be best for student learning. And this is why when I tried to implement reforms that challenge this power structure by insisting on equal treatment and merit-based evaluation, I got pushed out. I was threatening the interests of the most powerful players, and that is not something the system tolerates. Now, we are getting to the heart of game theory. And this is the part where everything starts to come together and make sense. In game theory, the key insight is that games are constructed when the interests of different players converge. What I mean by that is that there has to be some set of rules and outcomes that all the important players can accept, even if it is not ideal for any of them. The game exists at the intersection of what different stakeholders want, and the actual rules and practices of the system emerge from where those interests overlap. So let's think about what this convergence point looks like in education. Parents want face and good outcomes measured by grades and college admissions. Teachers want to minimize their workload while keeping their jobs. Administrators want to keep powerful parents happy and avoid problems. Government wants compliance and social stability. Colleges want money and successful alumni. Where do all these interests meet? They meet at a system that looks like this. Easy grades, lots of white faces to signal prestige, some top students who get into prestigious universities for marketing purposes, minimal actual learning requirements, and high tolerance for cheating and shortcuts as long as the final outcomes look good. Now, do you see why schools work the way they do? It is not an accident, and it is not the result of incompetence or lack of resources. The system is functioning exactly as it is designed to function, given the interests and incentives of the players involved. Schools are optimized not for learning, but for keeping important stakeholders satisfied while minimizing effort and conflict. That is the convergence point where everyone's interests align, and that is the game that actually gets played. Let me make this more concrete with some examples. Why do international schools hire so many white teachers who might not actually be qualified or experienced? Because parents associate white faces with quality education, and they are willing to pay premium prices for that association, regardless of whether it actually results in better learning outcomes. Why do teachers give such easy grades? Because if they give harder grades, students and parents complain, and administrators pressure them to raise the grades. So it is much easier to just give everyone A's or B's and avoid the conflict. Why is there so much cheating in schools? And why does it go largely unpunished? Because actually, cracking down on cheating would mean failing students or disciplining them harshly, and that would upset parents and hurt the school's graduation rates and college admission statistics. So it is easier to look the other way and let students cheat as long as they are not too obvious about it. Why do schools have such high turnover with teachers and students leaving all the time? Because the system is not actually designed to create a stable, healthy community. It is designed to process students through and collect tuition revenue. And as long as new students and teachers keep coming in, nobody cares that others are leaving. This is why my reforms failed, even though they were producing good educational outcomes. I was trying to create a different game with different rules that didn't align with where the major stakeholders' interests converge. I wanted merit-based evaluation, but that threatened powerful parents. I wanted transparency about mistakes and continuous improvement, but that made administrators uncomfortable because it meant admitting imperfection. I wanted students to work hard and be challenged, but that made students and parents unhappy because it was more difficult and stressful. I was operating outside the convergence point, and that is why I got pushed out. So let me paint you a picture of what the modern school game actually looks like. When you understand all these incentives and interests, you have a school that markets itself very well with beautiful facilities and nice websites and motivational language about excellence and innovation. The admissions team is very good at their job, attracting families who can pay premium tuition. The school hires lots of foreign teachers, especially white teachers, because that is what the parents want to see. and it allows the school to charge more money. These teachers might not be particularly qualified or experienced, but they look the part, and that is what matters. Inside the classrooms, instruction is pretty mediocre. Teachers follow textbooks and give PowerPoint presentations and assign busy work. But there isn't much deep learning happening. Students are bored and distracted, but they are getting decent grades because teachers don't want to deal with complaints. The curriculum is designed to cover a lot of material superficially rather than exploring anything in depth, because depth is harder to measure and market. Everything is optimized for standardized testing and college admissions rather than actual intellectual development. The school maintains a small group of star students who get lots of resources and attention. These are usually kids who were already strong students when they arrived, often from wealthy families who can afford extra tutoring and test prep. The school gives these students special opportunities and support. And when they get into prestigious universities, the school uses that for marketing. Look at our amazing college admissions results. But the reality is that the school's contribution to these students' success is pretty minimal. They would have succeeded regardless of where they went to school. Meanwhile, the vast majority of students are getting a mediocre education, but their parents don't really know or care as long as their kids are getting good grades. When students struggle or cheat or take shortcuts, the school mostly looks the other way because actually holding students accountable would create too many problems. There is a lot of cheating happening, both on the student's part and in terms of the school inflating grades and credentials. But everyone pretends not to notice because acknowledging it would be embarrassing and complicated. Teachers come and go frequently because the working conditions are not actually that great, despite what the school says in job postings. Teachers who are passionate about education get frustrated and burn out or leave for better opportunities. Teachers who just want an easy paycheck stick around longer, but they are not doing anything innovative or inspiring. Administrators focus most of their energy on managing relationships with important parents and putting out fires and maintaining the school's image. They are not really thinking about educational quality or long-term improvement. They are just trying to get through each day without a major crisis. And here is the crazy thing. Everyone involved in this system knows on some level that it is not really working. Students know they are not learning that much. Teachers know they are not teaching that well. Parents suspect their kids aren't getting their money's worth. Administrators know the quality isn't as high as they claim. But nobody has an incentive to call it out or try to change it because they are all benefiting from the current arrangement in different ways. The system is stable not because it is good, but because it serves enough powerful interests that nobody wants to rock the boat. Now, you might be thinking, okay, I understand why the current system works the way it does, given the incentives. But when did it become like this? Was it always this way? And the answer is no. It wasn't always this way. If you go back far enough in history, maybe to the 1980 seconds, especially in places like China, schools were actually much better. Despite having far fewer resources, teachers were respected and students were motivated and real learning was happening. So what changed? Why did we go from a system that worked reasonably well to a system that fails at its basic mission? The answer has to do with what we call the superstructure of society. And I want to spend a minute explaining this concept because it is crucial for understanding not just education, but how all social institutions evolve over time. The superstructure of society includes things like demographics and the economy and politics and culture. These are the big macro forces that shape how people think and behave and organize their lives. And societies go through predictable cycles where they are born and they mature and eventually they decline. And these cycles are driven by changes in the superstructure. There are three key metrics we can use to understand where a society is in this cycle. And these metrics are cohesion and openness and energy. Let me explain what each of these means. Energy means that people are motivated and driven and willing to work hard and focus on what they are doing. It doesn't just mean putting in long hours. It means caring about quality and taking pride in your work and wanting to do things well. Openness means that people are willing to learn and grow and admit when they have made mistakes and try to improve. And cohesion means that people see themselves as part of a larger community and care about collective outcomes, not just their own individual success. When a society is young and growing, all three of these metrics are high. People have energy because they believe things can get better and their effort will be rewarded. They have openness because they know they need to learn and adapt to improve their situation. And they have cohesion because they need to work together to overcome challenges that no individual can handle alone. In this context, schools work really well because everyone is invested in education as a path to a better future. Teachers take their jobs seriously and are respected by society. Students work hard because they know education is their ticket to opportunity. And parents support the system because they believe it will give their children better lives than they had. But as a society becomes wealthier and more successful, something changes. The urgency diminishes. People have more resources, so they don't need to work as hard or cooperate as much to meet their basic needs. Competition increases because there is more wealth to fight over and more ways to distinguish yourself from others. Corruption grows because people in power start using that power for personal benefit rather than collective good. And gradually those three key metrics, energy and openness and cohesion, start to decline. Instead of energy, you get complacency and people trying to do the minimum necessary to get by. Instead of openness, you get defensiveness, where admitting mistakes feels too risky because you might lose status or opportunities. Instead of cohesion, you get individualization, where everyone is focused on their own family success and sees other people's kids as competitors rather than fellow community members. And as these changes happen, the quality of social institutions, including schools, deteriorates because the cultural foundation that made them work has eroded. Let me make this concrete by talking about China in the 1,980 seconds, because this is a really clear example of how the superstructure shapes education. In the 1,980 seconds, China was just coming out of very difficult times, and the country was very poor. People didn't have much money or many material possessions, but there was incredible energy and optimism because things were getting better. The economy was starting to open up and opportunities were emerging, and people believed that if they worked hard and educated themselves, they could build better lives for themselves and their families. In this context, education was incredibly valued, and schools worked really well. Teachers felt respected and important because everyone understood that they were shaping the future generation. Teaching was seen as a noble profession, and the best and brightest people wanted to become teachers. The government paid teachers decent salaries relative to other jobs and gave them high social status and respected their professional autonomy. Teachers weren't micromanaged or treated as interchangeable workers. They were trusted as experts who knew how to educate children. Students were motivated to learn because education was the main path to opportunity. If you did well in school, you could go to university and get a good job and help support your family and move up in society. So students took school seriously and worked hard, not because they were forced to, but because they understood the stakes and believed their effort would pay off. Parents supported education even when they themselves weren't well educated because they wanted their children to have opportunities they never had. There was a sense that we are all in this together, and investing in the next generation benefits everyone. And here is what is interesting. Students in the 1,980 seconds actually did less homework and took fewer tests than students do today, but they learned much more. Why? Because the learning was meaningful and engaging, and students were internally motivated rather than just trying to please teachers or get good grades. Schools focused on depth rather than breadth, taking time to really explore subjects and make connections rather than rushing through material superficially. The curriculum was less standardized, which gave teachers flexibility to follow students' interests in questions. There was less pressure and stress, but more actual education. Compare that to today, where students spend many more hours studying and take constant tests and feel enormous pressure, but learn much less. Why? Because the cultural foundation has changed. Students today come from wealthier families on average. So education no longer feels like the only path to success. Parents can provide comfortable lives for their kids, regardless of academic performance, through family, wealth, and connections. So, students are less motivated to work hard and more likely to take shortcuts or cheat or just go through the motions. Teachers today are less respected and have less autonomy. They are paid relatively less than in the 1,980 seconds when you adjust for cost of living and other opportunities. Teaching has become less attractive as a profession. So, it is harder to recruit talented people, and teachers face much more pressure from parents and administrators and government bureaucrats. So, they have less space to actually teach and more time spent on documentation and compliance and managing complaints. The energy and openness and cohesion that made schools work in the 1,980 seconds have been replaced by complacency and defensiveness and competition. Now, let me give you another example to illustrate this same principle but from a different context. Let's talk about Finland, which has one of the best education systems in the world. According to international comparisons, Finnish students consistently score at the top on standardized tests, and surveys show that Finnish students are happy and engaged and love learning. So, what is Finland doing differently? Are they spending way more money on education? Do they have some magic curriculum or teaching method? No. The secret to Finland's success is the superstructure of their society. Finland is a small country with only about 5 million people, and it has very high levels of cohesion and openness and energy. Finnish culture emphasizes social solidarity and collective well-being rather than individual competition. People trust each other and trust institutions and believe that everyone should have access to good education and healthcare and other public services. This creates a completely different set of incentives than what you find in more individualistic or unequal societies. In Finland, parents don't see other children as competitors to their own kids. They want all children to receive good education because they understand that a well-educated population benefits everyone. So there is strong public support for investing in schools and paying teachers well and maintaining small class sizes. Teachers in Finland are highly respected professionals who are given a lot of autonomy and trust. To become a teacher, you need a master's degree, and the profession is competitive and prestigious. Teachers are paid well relative to other jobs, and they have job security, and they are trusted to make professional decisions about curriculum and pedagogy. Because teachers are respected and well supported, they are motivated to do good work. They take pride in their profession, and they care about student learning, not just as an abstract concept, but as a real mission they are trying to accomplish. And because the culture values education and learning, students are motivated too. They understand that education is valuable not just for getting jobs, but for becoming informed citizens and interesting people who can participate fully in society. There is less emphasis on testing and competition and more emphasis on intrinsic motivation and deep understanding. The key point is that Finland's educational success is not primarily about their specific policies or practices, although those matter too. It is about the underlying social and cultural conditions that make good education possible. You could try to copy Finland's education policies and implement them in a different country, and they probably wouldn't work because the superstructure is different. If you don't have cohesion and openness and energy in your society, you cannot just import them by changing school policies. You have to address the deeper structural issues that shape how people think about education and their relationships with each other. This is why education reform is so difficult and why most attempts at reform fail. People think they can fix schools by changing curriculum or testing or teacher training or funding levels, but those are all downstream of more fundamental issues about how society is organized and what values people hold and what incentives they face. If you want to improve schools, you need to improve society. And that is a much bigger and harder challenge than most reformers are willing to acknowledge. So now let's talk about why wealth and success can actually make education worse rather than better. And this is one of the most counterintuitive aspects of this whole analysis. You would think that as countries get richer, they would invest more in education and schools would improve. But often the opposite happens. Why? Because wealth changes the incentive structure in ways that undermine the cultural conditions needed for good education. Let me explain how this works. When a society is poor, education is the main path to upward mobility. Parents who grew up in poverty or difficult circumstances see education as the way to ensure their children have better lives. They are willing to sacrifice and support schools because they believe education can transform their children's futures. Students are motivated because they understand that working hard in school can open doors that would otherwise be closed to them. And this creates a virtuous cycle where everyone is invested in making education work. But as society becomes wealthier, something shifts. Parents who have money can provide comfortable lives for their children regardless of educational outcomes. They can buy apartments and cars and use connections to get their kids jobs or business opportunities. So, education becomes less critical to success and more of a status marker. Parents still care about education, but now they care more about the prestige and social signaling than about actual learning. They want their kids to go to famous schools and get impressive credentials, but they are not as concerned about whether their kids are actually developing knowledge and skills. Students internalize this changed incentive structure. If they know their parents can support them financially, no matter how they do in school, then they have less motivation to work hard. Why stress over grades or struggle with difficult material when you can coast through and still have a comfortable life? And if education is primarily about status and credentials rather than actual learning, then it makes sense to optimize for grades rather than understanding. Cheating becomes more attractive because the goal is to get the grade, not to learn the material. Wealth also increases inequality, and this creates competition rather than cohesion. When there is a small wealthy elite, they want to preserve their advantages and pass them on to their children. They use their money and influence to ensure their kids get special treatment in schools and have access to better resources and opportunities. This makes education a zero-sum game where rich kids' advantages come at the expense of everyone else. And once you are in a zero-sum competitive dynamic, cohesion breaks down and everyone focuses on their own family's interests rather than the common good. Corruption grows with wealth too. When there is money sloshing around in the system, people find ways to capture it for personal benefit. School administrators can be bribed or influenced. Teachers can be pressured to give better grades to wealthy students. Admissions to prestigious schools can be bought through donations or connections. All of this undermines the meritocratic ideal, where students succeed based on ability and effort. And when students see that success is determined more by money and connections than by merit, they become cynical and disengaged. So we end up in this paradoxical situation where wealthy societies with more resources for education often have worse educational outcomes than poorer societies that have to make do with less. It is not about resources. It is about incentives and culture and social structure. This is why simply throwing more money at education doesn't fix the problem. You need to address the underlying social dynamics that wealth has created. And that is incredibly difficult because the people who benefit from the current system are the ones with the most power to resist change. Now, I want to take you deeper into game theory by explaining something really important about how real people actually behave in complex social systems. Up until now, we have been talking about the education game as if it is a single game with a clear set of rules and players. But that is actually an oversimplification, because in reality, everyone is playing multiple games simultaneously. And these different games interact with each other in complicated ways. Understanding this helps explain why people's behavior sometimes seems contradictory or irrational when actually they are just responding to multiple competing incentives. Let's take parents as an example, because parents are particularly complex players with lots of different identities and roles. A parent is not just a parent. They are also a family member with siblings and cousins and extended family. They are a colleague at work with professional relationships and ambitions. They are a member of various social circles with friends and neighbors and community connections. Each of these identities involves a different game with different rules and different goals, and parents have to navigate all these games simultaneously. So when a parent is making decisions about their child's education, they are not just thinking about what is best for the child in isolation. They are thinking about how their child's performance reflects on them in their family game. If you have siblings or cousins, there is often subtle or not so subtle competition about whose kids are more successful. This creates pressure to ensure your child does better than other family members' children, so you can maintain your status and self-respect within the family hierarchy. A parent might push their child to study extra hours or get into a more prestigious school, not because it is best for the child, but because they need to prove something to their brother or sister. Then there is the colleague game, where parents are competing and cooperating with people at work. In this game, it is important that your child is able to form relationships with your colleagues' children, because those relationships might translate into business opportunities or social connections down the line. So parents care not just about their child's individual success, but about whether their child fits into the social network of other elite families. This is why wealthy parents care so much about sending their kids to the same schools as other wealthy families' kids. It is about network access and social reproduction. The colleague game also involves considerations of face and status. When you are at work functions or social gatherings with colleagues, there is an expectation that you will talk about your children and their accomplishments. If your colleagues are bragging about their kids getting into Harvard or Yale or Stanford, then you feel pressured to have similar achievements to report. This isn't necessarily because you think those schools will provide better education, but because you need to maintain your status in this social game. And if you cannot compete on that level, it feels like a loss, not just for your child, but for you personally. Now, here is where it gets really interesting. These different games can create conflicting incentives that pull parents in different directions. What is best for your child's actual learning and development might not be what maximizes your status in the family game or the colleague game. For example, maybe your child would thrive in a less competitive environment where they could pursue their own interests without constant pressure. But if you make that choice, you might lose face among your siblings or colleagues who will see it as your child being unable to compete. So you end up pushing your child into a high-pressure competitive environment, not because you think it is best for them, but because you are trying to win different games. This is true for all the players, not just parents. Students are playing multiple games too. The learning game, the friendship game, the pleasing parents game, the getting into college game. Teachers are playing the doing their job game, the keeping administrators happy game, the managing their personal life game. Every player has multiple identities and multiple games, and they are constantly making trade-offs and balancing competing demands. And this complexity is why simple reforms often fail, because they don't account for all these different layers of motivation and constraint. Now, I want to talk about one of the most powerful forces shaping human behavior in any game, and that is the fear of ostracism, or what you might call exile or being kicked out of the group. This is a primal fear that operates at a very deep psychological level, because for most of human history, being excluded from your social group meant death. If you were alone in the wilderness without the support and protection of your tribe, you would not survive long. So we have evolved very strong instincts to avoid being ostracized. And these instincts shape behavior in powerful ways, even in modern contexts where exclusion doesn't literally threaten our survival. In the context of education and schools, this fear of ostracism is one of the main forces that keeps the system stable even when it is not working well. Everyone involved knows on some level that the system is flawed, but they are afraid to challenge it too directly or step too far outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior because they might be labeled as troublemakers or outsiders. And once you are labeled that way, it is very hard to get back into the group's good graces. You become marked as someone who doesn't play by the rules, and other people start to distance themselves from you. This is what happened to me when I was trying to reform the school in Shenzhen. By insisting on fairness and merit-based evaluation and refusing to give special treatment to powerful families, I was violating the unspoken rules of the game. From the perspective of other players, I was threatening the social order that everyone else had accepted. And the way the system dealt with that threat was by labeling me as a dictator and unfair and eventually pushing me out. Once I was labeled as someone who doesn't fit in, other schools became reluctant to hire me because they didn't want that kind of disruption in their systems either. Parents face similar pressures. If a parent starts questioning the system too loudly, or complaining that their child isn't actually learning anything, or suggesting that the whole education game is a waste of time and money, they risk being seen as difficult or unreasonable. Other parents might start avoiding them because they don't want to be associated with someone who is making trouble. School administrators might label them as problem parents, and their child might face subtle discrimination or exclusion as a result. So most parents, even when they have doubts about the system, keep those doubts private and go along with the program because the cost of standing out is too high. Teachers experience this too. A teacher who tries to maintain high standards or refuse to inflate grades or call out cheating might face resistance from colleagues who see them as making everyone else look bad. If other teachers are taking shortcuts and giving easy grades, then a teacher who doesn't do that is implicitly criticizing everyone else's approach. And that can lead to social isolation, where other teachers stop collaborating or sharing resources or including you in informal networks. So teachers face pressure to conform to the group norms even when those norms undermine educational quality. This fear of ostracism is why meaningful reform is so difficult. It is not enough to have good ideas, or even to implement changes that produce better results. You also have to navigate the social dynamics of the existing system and find ways to change things without triggering the ostracism response. That means working within the boundaries of what is acceptable to existing stakeholders and making changes incrementally rather than revolutionarily. It means not directly challenging people's status or interests, but instead finding ways to align your reforms with what they already want. This is a very different approach than what I tried to do, and it is why my reforms ultimately failed. So now, let's return to this crucial concept of the convergence point, because understanding this is essential for understanding how any system works and how to change it. Remember that the convergence point is where the interests of different stakeholders overlap. And it is at this convergence point that the rules and practices of the system emerge. But here is something important I need to clarify. The convergence point is not a single fixed spot. It is actually an area or zone where there's flexibility and room for different arrangements as long as they stay within certain boundaries. What this means is that reform is possible, but only within the convergence zone. You can shift a system from one point to another within that zone, and stakeholders will accept it even if they are not thrilled about it because their core interests are still being served. But if you try to move the system outside the convergence zone into a space where one or more major stakeholders feel their interests are fundamentally threatened, then you will face resistance that you probably cannot overcome. The system will push back and ultimately reject your reforms because they are incompatible with how the players want to play the game. My mistake in Shenzhen was that I tried to create an entirely new game with new rules that existed outside the convergence zone. I thought I could be like a god, creating a perfect world where everyone would play according to my vision of how education should work. I imagined a system where students would be judged purely on merit, where everyone would be treated equally, where transparency and continuous improvement would be valued, where learning itself would be the goal rather than grades or status. But this vision didn't align with what any of the major stakeholders actually wanted. Parents didn't want a system where their money and connections couldn't buy advantages for their kids. Teachers didn't want a system that required them to work harder and constantly improve their practice. Administrators didn't want a system that exposed their weaknesses and created conflict with powerful families. The government didn't want a system that encouraged students to question authority and think too independently. So even though my system produced good results in terms of students getting into good universities, that wasn't enough to make it sustainable because it violated too many stakeholders' core interests. If I had understood game theory better at the time, I would have taken a completely different approach. Instead of trying to impose my own vision, I would have first figured out where the convergence point actually was. I would have mapped out what each major stakeholder really wanted. Not what they said they wanted, but what they actually cared about. Then, I would have looked for ways to move the system within the convergence zone toward better educational outcomes, without threatening anyone's fundamental interests. This would have meant accepting some compromises and limitations that I found frustrating, but it also would have meant creating something more sustainable. For example, I might have kept a special treatment for wealthy families, but found ways to justify it that felt less corrupt. Maybe I could have created an explicit sponsorship system where wealthy families donated to scholarship funds for less privileged students in exchange for guaranteed admission for their own kids. That would still serve the wealthy family's interests, but it would at least create some benefit for others and could be framed as generous rather than corrupt. It is not the ideal I wanted, but it might have been sustainable. Or I could have made the reforms more gradual, introducing new teaching methods and activities alongside the existing system rather than replacing it entirely. This would have given stakeholders time to adapt and see benefits before committing fully. It would have reduced the perception of chaos and uncertainty that made people uncomfortable, and it would have allowed me to build a coalition of supporters gradually rather than trying to fight everyone at once. These kinds of strategic considerations are what game theory teaches us, and they are essential for anyone trying to change complex systems. Now, I want to explore a really fascinating and somewhat disturbing aspect of human behavior, which is our tendency to adapt to whatever system we find ourselves in, even when that system is clearly dysfunctional or harmful. This is one of the most powerful mechanisms that keeps bad systems in place because even people who might initially resist or question the system eventually learn to accept it and play by its rules. And once enough people have adapted, the system becomes very difficult to change because changing it would require people to unlearn behaviors and strategies they have invested time in developing. Think about students who enter school full of natural curiosity and excitement about learning. Young children ask endless questions and want to understand how everything works. They are intrinsically motivated to explore and discover and make sense of the world. But then they enter the school system and they quickly learn that curiosity is not actually rewarded. What is rewarded is compliance and memorization and giving the teacher the answer they want to hear. Asking too many questions is seen as disruptive. Following your own interests rather than the curriculum is seen as being off task. Thinking deeply about topics is less valuable than moving through material quickly to cover everything that might be on the test. So what do smart students do? They adapt. They learn to suppress their natural curiosity and instead focus on figuring out what the system wants from them. They develop strategies for getting good grades without necessarily learning anything deep or meaningful. They learn when it is okay to cheat or take shortcuts and when they need to actually put in effort. They learn how to please teachers and manage their parents' expectations and maintain friendships while still competing for rankings. These are real skills that require intelligence and social awareness to develop, but they are skills for gaming the system rather than skills for actual learning and growth. And here's the thing. After years of adapting to this system, students forget that there was ever an alternative. They internalize the system's values and assumptions. They start to believe that education really is about grades and rankings and credentials rather than understanding and growth. They start to believe that the point of life is to compete against others and accumulate status markers rather than to pursue meaning and contribute to the common good. The system doesn't just constrain their behavior. It actually shapes their identity and their understanding of what is possible and valuable. This is why when someone comes along and tries to create a different kind of educational environment, students often resist or struggle to adapt, even when the new environment would actually be better for them. They spent years learning how to succeed in the old system, and now you are asking them to unlearn all of that and develop new skills and values. That is uncomfortable and risky. What if they cannot succeed in the new system? What if all the strategies they have developed are suddenly worthless? It feels safer to stick with what they know, even if they are not happy with it. Teachers go through a similar process. Someone might become a teacher because they love their subject and want to inspire students. But they quickly learn that passion and inspiration are not what the system rewards. What matters is maintaining control of the classroom and covering the required curriculum and keeping parents and administrators happy. Teachers who try to do things differently often face resistance and criticism and additional work. So most teachers eventually adapt and become more cynical and focus on getting through each day rather than trying to make a meaningful difference. And once they have adapted, it becomes very hard to change because they have built their professional identity around coping with the system as it is. This dynamic of adaptation is one of the main reasons why bad systems persist even when everyone knows they are bad. People have adapted to the system and built their lives around it and developed strategies for functioning within it. Changing the system would require them to give up those adaptations and develop new ones. And that is costly and uncertain. So there is enormous inertia keeping things the way they are, even when almost everyone would agree that things could and should be better. This is the power of incentives. And this is why understanding game theory is so important for anyone who wants to change anything. So now let me bring all this together and talk about what game theory actually teaches us and why it is such a powerful framework for understanding the world. Game theory is not really about games in the recreational sense, even though that is where the name comes from. It is about understanding any situation where multiple actors with different interests are making strategic decisions that affect each other. This includes not just explicit games like poker or chess, but also social institutions like schools and markets and political systems and even personal relationships. The key insight of game theory is that to understand why things are the way they are, you need to understand the incentives facing different players and how those incentives interact. You cannot just look at what people say they want or what official policies claim to promote. You have to look at what people actually respond to and what behaviors get rewarded or punished by the system. Once you understand the real incentive structure, you can predict how people will behave, and you can understand why systems produce the outcomes they do, even when those outcomes seem counterproductive or irrational. This is a very different way of thinking than most people are taught. We are usually taught to think in terms of ideals and principles and how things should be. We are taught that if we have good intentions and work hard, we can make the world better. And there is some truth to that, but it is incomplete. Good intentions don't automatically translate into good outcomes if the incentive structure pushes people toward different behaviors. You can have a system where everyone individually is trying to do the right thing, but the collective outcome is still terrible because of how the incentives are structured. This is what I learned the hard way through my experience trying to reform schools. I had good intentions, and I worked incredibly hard, and I created programs that produced real results. But I didn't understand the game I was playing. I didn't understand what the other players really wanted and what would happen if I threatened their interests. I thought merit and results would be enough, but I was wrong. The game is not about merit or results. It is about power and relationships and maintaining the existing order. And once I understood that, I could see why I failed and what I would need to do differently next time. Game theory also teaches us something important about change and reform. If you want to change a system, you cannot just replace it with something completely different that exists outside the convergence point of stakeholder interest. That will trigger resistance that you probably cannot overcome. Instead, you need to understand the existing game and figure out how to move it incrementally within the convergence zone toward better outcomes. This requires patience and strategic thinking and willingness to accept partial improvements rather than demanding perfection. It means building coalitions and addressing people's real concerns rather than dismissing them as selfish or short-sighted. But game theory also teaches us to be realistic about the limits of change. Some systems are so deeply entrenched and serve powerful interests so well that meaningful reform might not be possible without much larger social and economic changes. In those cases, you might need to accept that you cannot fix the system and instead focus on protecting yourself and the people you care about from its worst effects. Or you might need to build alternative institutions outside the existing system rather than trying to reform it from within. These are hard choices, but they are informed by a realistic understanding of power and incentives. Now, I want to end with a reflection on identity and human nature, because this is really at the heart of what game theory reveals about the human condition. One of the most profound insights from thinking about games and incentives is that we are not fixed, unchanging selves with stable preferences and values. Instead, we are constantly being shaped by the games we play and the roles we occupy. Who you are in kindergarten is different from who you are in high school. It is different from who you will be in college or in your first job or as a parent. And these differences are not just about maturation or aging. They are about adapting to different games with different rules and different incentive structures. Think about how your own behavior changes depending on context. The way you act with your parents is different from how you act with your friends, is different from how you act with teachers or strangers. These aren't fake personas you are putting on in each context. These are all genuinely you, but different aspects of you get activated or suppressed depending on what game you are playing in that moment. And over time, as you spend more time in certain games and less time in others, your identity shifts to reflect the games that dominate your life. This has profound implications for understanding behavior and for thinking about moral responsibility. When we see someone behaving badly in a school context, whether that is a student cheating or a teacher phoning it in, or an administrator protecting corrupt practices, we tend to judge them as bad people with character flaws. But game theory suggests a different interpretation. They are normal people responding rationally to the incentives they face. Put those same people in a different game with different rules and incentives, and they might behave completely differently. The game shapes the player more than the player shapes the game. This doesn't mean people have no moral agency or cannot be held responsible for their choices. but it does mean we should be more humble about judging others and more skeptical about attributing behavior to fixed character traits. If you have successfully navigated the education system and developed good study habits and got into a good college, that says something about your ability to adapt to that particular game. But it doesn't necessarily mean you are smarter or more hardworking or more virtuous than someone who didn't succeed in that game. It might just mean you were better at reading the incentives and adapting your behavior accordingly. And this also means we should be thoughtful about what games we choose to play or what games we create for others to play. If you are a parent or teacher or policymaker, you have the power to shape the incentive structures that other people operate within. And those structures will shape who those people become. If you create games that reward collaboration and curiosity and intellectual risk-taking, you will help develop those qualities in people. If you create games that reward selfishness and short-term thinking and gaming the system, you will help develop those qualities instead. The choice is yours, but you have to be honest about what incentives you are actually creating, not what you wish you were creating. This is why the education system matters so much and why it is so tragic that the current system is structured the way it is. We are taking young people during their most formative years and putting them through a game that teaches them to value grades over learning, competition over collaboration, external validation over internal motivation, and gaming the system over honest effort. And then we wonder why they graduate as cynical credential collectors rather than curious, engaged citizens. The game made them that way. We made them that way through the incentive structures we created and maintain. And if we want different outcomes, we need different games. So where does this leave us? What should you do with this understanding of how the education game actually works? Well, first and most importantly, I want you to understand that this analysis is not meant to be depressing or to make you give up on education or improvement. Yes, the system is deeply flawed, and yes, meaningful reform is difficult, and yes, powerful interests benefit from keeping things the way they are. But understanding how games work is the first step toward being able to navigate them effectively, or change them, or create better alternatives. If you are a student, understanding game theory can help you make smarter choices about your own education. You can learn to distinguish between what the system rewards and what actually matters for your development and growth. You can be strategic about playing the credentialing game when you need to, while also pursuing genuine learning and curiosity outside of or alongside that game. You can protect your intellectual independence and love of learning even while navigating a system that often works against those things. Knowledge of the game gives you power that students who don't understand what is happening don't have. If you are a parent, understanding game theory can help you make better decisions about your children's education and about what you really want for them. You can question whether prestigious credentials are actually worth the cost in terms of stress and lost childhood and strained relationships. You can think more carefully about whether you are making choices based on what is best for your child or based on what looks good to your siblings or colleagues. You can consider whether there might be alternative paths to success and fulfillment that don't require participating in the conventional credentialing game at all. If you are a teacher, understanding game theory can help you find ways to do meaningful work within a flawed system. You can identify where you have autonomy and flexibility and use that space to actually teach rather than just going through the motions. You can find students who are genuinely interested in learning and invest your energy in them rather than spreading yourself thin trying to reach everyone. You can build relationships with other teachers who share your values and create pockets of excellence even within mediocre institutions. And you can be realistic about what you can and cannot change, so you don't burn yourself out fighting unwinnable battles. If you are an administrator or policymaker, understanding game theory is essential for creating reforms that might actually work. You need to understand stakeholder interest and power dynamics and how to move systems within their convergence zones. You need to be strategic about building coalitions and addressing concerns and making incremental progress rather than trying to impose perfect solutions from above. And you need to be humble about the limits of what policy can accomplish and honest about whose interests are really being served by any proposed change. But most importantly for all of us, understanding game theory means understanding that systems are human creations that reflect human choices about incentives and values and power. They are not natural laws that cannot be changed. They are games that we collectively maintain through our participation and compliance. And that means we have more power than we might think to change things or opt out or create alternatives. It requires courage and creativity and strategic thinking and often collective action, but it is possible. Systems change when enough people understand how they work and decide they want something different. The education system we have today is not the only possible education system. Other arrangements are possible and in fact have existed at other times and places. Finland shows us one alternative model. The Chinese education system of the 1980 seconds shows us another. Experimental schools and alternative pedagogies show us still others. The question is not whether better systems are possible, but whether we are willing to do the hard work of understanding the current system and building coalitions for change and accepting trade-offs and compromises and gradual progress rather than demanding overnight transformation. So, let me leave you with this final thought. And this is really the most important thing I want you to take away from this entire analysis. The lesson here is not that schools suck and there is nothing we can do about it. The lesson is not that people are selfish and systems are corrupt and we should just accept mediocrity. The real lesson is that if you want to understand why anything is the way it is, or if you want to change anything, you need to understand the game that is being played and who the players are and what they really want and where their interests converge. This framework applies not just to education, but to everything. Politics and economics and relationships and careers and all of human social life can be understood through the lens of game theory. Who are the players? What do they want? What incentives do they face? How do their interests interact? Where is the convergence point? These questions will help you make sense of situations that otherwise seem confusing or irrational, and they will help you be more effective at navigating those situations or changing them if that is what you want to do. But game theory also teaches us intellectual humility. It teaches us that our naive assumptions about how the world works or should work are often wrong. It teaches us that good intentions are not enough and that systems produce outcomes based on incentives, not on what we wish would happen. It teaches us that change is difficult and requires strategic thinking and patience and willingness to work within constraints rather than simply demanding that constraints disappear. These are hard lessons and they can be uncomfortable, but they are essential for anyone who wants to engage effectively with the world as it actually is. I learned these lessons through failure and painful experience. I went into education as an idealistic young reformer who thought I could change everything through passion and hard work and good ideas. And I got crushed by forces I didn't understand because I didn't know I was playing a game and I didn't know the rules. Looking back, I can see exactly where I went wrong and what I would do differently. But I also don't regret the experience because it taught me to see games everywhere and to think strategically about power and incentives and stakeholder interests. And that understanding has been invaluable in everything I have done since. My hope is that by sharing this story in this framework, I can save you from having to learn the same lessons through equally painful experience. You don't have to accept the world as it is, but you do have to understand it as it is before you can change it. You don't have to play games you don't believe in, but you do have to recognize when you are in a game and what the stakes are and what strategies might actually work. This is what game theory offers. Not cynicism or resignation, but clarity and strategic thinking and realistic assessment of possibilities. So, as we continue this course and apply game theory to global events and complex systems, remember what we learned today about education. Remember that things that seem irrational or dysfunctional often make perfect sense when you understand the incentive structures. Remember that systems persist because they serve someone's interests, even if they harm others. Remember that change requires understanding stakeholder interests and working within convergence zones. And remember that you are shaped by the games you play. So choose your games carefully and think about what kind of person those games are making you become. The world is full of games, and we are all players, whether we realize it or not. The question is whether we are going to play blindly or whether we are going to understand the rules and make strategic choices about how we participate. Game theory gives us the tools to play consciously and effectively. And that is a form of power that no one can take away from you once you have it. So let's continue this journey together and see what else game theory can teach us about how the world works and how we can navigate it and maybe even change it for the better. Thank you.